The boy was bleeding when he stumbled onto the porch, not the kind of bleeding that came from a fall or a scrape with barbed wire. This was deliberate. A gash across his shoulder, deep enough that the fabric of his torn shirt clung to the wound like a second skin. His eyes were wild, darting back toward the tree line, as if something might come crashing through at any moment. Coleman Briggs had been sitting in his chair, boots propped on the rail, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. He wasn't expecting company. He never did. His ranch sat far enough from town that most folks forgot it existed, and that was exactly how he liked it. But when the boy appeared thin, maybe 13, with dirt streaked across his face and terror carved into every line of his expression, Coleman's hand moved instinctively to the rifle leaning against the doorframe. The boy stopped at the bottom of the steps, swaying. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Coleman rose slowly, his chair creaking behind him. "Easy now," Coleman said, his voice low and steady. "You hurt bad?" The boy shook his head, but his legs gave out beneath him. He caught himself on the railing, knuckles white. "Sir, if they come, hide my sister." Coleman's jaw tightened. He stepped down from the porch, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. "Who's coming, please?" The boy's voice cracked. "She's in the trees. She's scared." I told her to wait, but he looked over his shoulder again, his breath hitching. "They'll kill her if they find her." Coleman didn't ask again. He moved past the boy, scanning the edge of the property where the pines grew thick and dark. The evening air smelled like dust and coming rain, but underneath it, faint and metallic, was the scent of smoke. Not close yet, but close enough. "How many?" Coleman asked without turning around. "4, maybe 5. The boy's voice was barely a whisper now. "They burned our place. Killed my pa. My ma." He stopped, his throat working. "They said we took something. We didn't. I swear we didn't." Coleman's hand flexed at his side. He'd heard stories like this before. Men with too much power and not enough conscience, riding through territories like they owned the land and everyone on it. Sometimes they wore badges. Sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter much, either way. "Your sister," Coleman said. "Where exactly?" The boy pointed toward a cluster of cottonwoods near the creek. "She's small, 8 years old. I told her not to make a sound." Coleman turned back to the boy, studying him. Blood still seeped through his shirt, and his face was pale beneath the grime. But his eyes, those were steady now. Desperate, but steady. "What's your name?" Coleman asked. "Ethan." "Ethan, you stay here. Don't move." Coleman grabbed the rifle and started toward the trees, his boots crunching over dry grass. He didn't run. Running made noise, and noise brought attention. He moved like he always did, deliberate, measured, the way a man learned to move when he'd spent years in places where one wrong step could end everything. The girl was exactly where Ethan said she'd be, curled beneath the low-hanging branches of a cottonwood, her knees pulled to her chest. She had dark hair, tangled and wild, and her dress was torn at the hem. When she saw Coleman, she flinched, pressing herself harder against the trunk. "It's all right," Coleman said quietly, crouching down a few feet away. "Your brother sent me." She didn't move. Her eyes were wide, glassy with fear. "My name's Coleman. I'm going to take you somewhere safe. But I need you to come with me now." For a long moment she just stared at him. Then, slowly, she nodded. Coleman extended his hand, and after a heartbeat of hesitation, she took it. Her fingers were small and cold, trembling in his palm. He led her back to the house, keeping his body between her and the open land. Ethan was still on the porch, leaning heavily against the post now. When he saw his sister, his face crumpled with relief. "Lizzie," he breathed. The girl broke away from Coleman and ran to her brother, wrapping her arms around his waist. He winced but didn't pull away, resting his hand on the back of her head. Coleman climbed the steps, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was almost gone now, just a sliver of gold behind the mountains. In another 10 minutes, it would be full dark, and in the dark, men did the things they didn't want witnesses for. "They know you came this way?" Coleman asked. Ethan nodded. "We ran as far as we could. But they're fast, and they don't stop." Coleman looked down at the boy, at the girl clinging to him, and felt something old and familiar stir in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd tried to bury years ago, after the war, after the things he'd done and seen. The feeling that told him he couldn't walk away. Not from this. "Get inside," Coleman said. "Both of you." Ethan hesitated. "Sir, if they come, they're coming," Coleman said flatly. "That's not a question. Now get inside and stay away from the windows." He waited until they were through the door, then turned back to the land. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of hoofbeats. Distant still, but growing louder. Coleman checked his rifle, the motion automatic ingrained. 6 rounds. He had more inside, but 6 would have to do for now. He stepped off the porch and walked to the edge of the yard, planting himself between the house and the road. The hoofbeats grew louder, and Coleman Briggs did not move. They came like shadows bleeding out of the dusk. 5 riders spread wide across the road, moving at an easy trot. They weren't in a hurry. Men who hunted knew that panic made prey stupid, and stupidity made the kill easier. Coleman watched them approach, his rifle resting against his shoulder, his finger just outside the trigger guard. The one in the center rode a black gelding, tall and mean-looking. He wore a duster that hung open, revealing a gun belt slung low on his hip. His hat was pulled down, but Coleman could see the shape of his jaw, the hard line of his mouth. The others fanned out beside him, rough men, the kind who lived in the spaces between law and lawlessness, who took what they wanted because no one had ever told them no and made it stick. The leader pulled his horse to a stop 20 yards out. The others followed suit, their mounts shifting beneath them, restless. "Evening," the leader called, his voice easy, almost friendly. "Hell of a night for a ride." Coleman said nothing. The man tilted his head, studying him. "You live here?" "I do." "Alone?" Coleman's eyes didn't waver. "That's my business." The leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Fair enough. We're looking for a couple of kids. Boy and a girl. You see anyone like that come through here?" "No." The man's smile faded. He leaned forward in his saddle, resting his hands on the horn. "Now, friend, I'm going to ask you again. And I'm going to suggest you think real careful before you answer, because lying to me, that's a poor decision." Coleman shifted his weight just slightly. "I said no." One of the other riders, a wiry man with a scar running down the side of his face, spat into the dirt. "He's lying, Garrett. You can see it." The leader, Garrett, raised a hand. "Easy." He looked back at Coleman, his expression hardening. "Those kids stole from us. Now, I don't expect you to understand the particulars, but what I need you to understand is this. We're taking them back, one way or another." "They didn't steal anything," Coleman said evenly. "And they're not going anywhere with you." The silence that followed was thick, weighted. Garrett's horse stamped, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Then Garrett laughed. It was a low, ugly sound. "You got a death wish, old man? Old enough to know better than to hand kids over to men like you?" The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun, but Garrett stopped him with a look. "You don't know what you're getting into here," Garrett said, his voice dropping. "This isn't your fight. It is now." Garrett stared at him, and for a moment Coleman thought he might actually turn around. But then the man's expression shifted, something cold and calculating sliding into place. "All right," he said softly. "Have it your way." He wheeled his horse around, motioning for the others to follow. They rode back the way they came, disappearing into the gathering dark. Coleman didn't move until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then he turned and walked back to the house, his shoulders tight, his mind already working through what came next. Inside, Ethan and Lizzie were huddled together on the floor near the far wall. The boy had his arm around his sister, and both of them looked up when Coleman entered. "They're gone," Coleman said. Ethan's face didn't relax. For now. For now, Coleman agreed. He set the rifle down and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see out. The land was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt wrong, heavy. "Waiting. They'll come back," Ethan said. "They always do." Coleman let the curtain fall. "I know. Why didn't you just give us to them?" The boy's voice was raw, desperate. "You don't even know us. You don't owe us anything." Coleman turned to face him. "You're right. I don't." He crossed the room and knelt down in front of the boy, meeting his eyes. "But I know what men like that do. And I know what happens to kids when no one stands in the way." Ethan's jaw trembled. "My pa tried to stand in the way. They killed him anyway. I'm not your pa." "Then what are you?" Coleman didn't have an answer for that. Not one that would make sense. So instead he reached out and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, careful to avoid the wound. "Right now, I'm the man between you and them. And that's enough." Lizzie, who hadn't spoken since they came inside, looked up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was something fierce in them. "Are you going to fight them?" Coleman held her gaze. "Yes. Are you going to win?" He didn't lie to her. "I don't know." She nodded slowly as if that answer was enough. Ethan, on the other hand, looked like he might break apart. "I can help," the boy said suddenly. "I can shoot. I'm not great, but no." "But no," Coleman said again, firmer this time. "You stay here with your sister. You keep her safe. That's your job." Ethan's hands curled into fists, but he didn't argue. Coleman stood and moved back to the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. Somewhere out there, Garrett and his men were waiting, planning. And when they came back, it wouldn't be to talk. "Get some water," Coleman said without turning around. "And find something to eat if you can. It's going to be a long night." Behind him, he heard the soft shuffle of movement as Ethan helped Lizzie to her feet. But Coleman's focus was already elsewhere, on the shapes he couldn't see yet, on the violence he knew was coming, and on the choice he'd already made. The fire started just after midnight. Coleman saw the glow first, a faint orange smudge against the black horizon. It was small at first, no bigger than a lantern flame, but it grew steadily, spreading like a wound opening. He'd been awake the entire time, stationed by the window with his rifle across his lap, watching the land for movement. Now, as the fire climbed higher, he felt his jaw tighten. They were burning the fields. It was a tactic as old as war itself. Smoke out the target. Force them into the open. Make them choose between staying put and suffocating or running straight into the guns waiting outside. Behind him, Ethan stirred. The boy had been dozing against the wall, his sister curled up beside him with her head on his lap. Now he sat up, blinking groggily, and then he saw the light through the window. "No," he whispered. Coleman didn't respond. He was already moving, crossing the room to the back door. He opened it just enough to slip through, then closed it quietly behind him. The night air was thick with smoke now, acrid and choking. He could hear the crackle of flames in the distance, growing louder by the second. The fire wasn't close to the house yet, but it would be. They were driving it toward him, using the wind to push it forward. Smart. Ruthless. Effective. Coleman circled around the side of the house, keeping low, his eyes scanning the tree line. The flames cast dancing shadows across the land, and in those shadows he saw them. Three riders, moving slowly, deliberately, herding the fire like shepherds with a flock. He raised his rifle and sighted the nearest one. The distance was maybe 50 yards, doable but not easy in the dark. He exhaled slowly, steadying his aim. Then a voice cut through the night. "You can still walk away from this." Coleman froze. The voice came from his left, closer than it should have been. He turned his head slowly and saw Garrett standing at the edge of the yard, his gun drawn but pointed at the ground. "How'd you get that close?" Coleman asked, his voice flat. Garrett smiled. "I'm good at what I do. That makes one of us." The smile faded. "Last chance, friend. Give us the kids and we ride out. You never see us again." Coleman kept his rifle trained on the riders in the distance. "And if I don't, then you burn with them." Coleman's finger tightened on the trigger. "You really think you're walking away from this?" Garrett's expression hardened. "I know I am, ma'am." For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire roared louder, closer, and the heat began to press against Coleman's back. Then, in one smooth motion, he swung the rifle toward Garrett and fired. The shot went wide intentionally. It kicked up dirt 2 feet to Garrett's right, and the man flinched, diving behind a water trough. Coleman didn't wait to see if he'd hit anything. He bolted back toward the house, reloading as he ran. Gunfire erupted behind him, bullets tearing through the air, splintering wood. One clipped the doorframe as he ducked inside, and another shattered the window above the sink. Coleman hit the floor hard, rolling to the side as glass rained down. "Stay down!" he shouted at Ethan and Lizzie, who were pressed flat against the far wall. The boy's face was white, his sister clinging to him like a lifeline. But they didn't scream. They didn't panic. Coleman would have admired that if he had the time. He crawled to the broken window and risked a glance outside. The fire was closer now, close enough that he could feel its heat through the shattered glass. The riders had dismounted and were advancing on foot, using the smoke as cover. He counted 4 shapes moving through the haze. That meant one was still out there, unaccounted for. Coleman cursed under his breath and reloaded. He had maybe 20 rounds left in the house, scattered across different pockets and shelves. Not nearly enough for a prolonged fight. "Ethan," he called over his shoulder, "there's a trap door under the rug in my bedroom." "You see it?" The boy nodded. "You take your sister down there. There's a tunnel. Leads out to the creek. You follow it as far as you can, and you don't stop until you hit the main road." "What about you?" "I'll hold them here." "No." Ethan's voice cracked. "I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are." "No." Coleman turned, his expression hard. "Boy, listen to me. Your job is to keep her alive. That's it. You don't owe me anything. You don't need to be brave. You just need to run." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't argue. He grabbed Lizzie's hand and pulled her toward the bedroom, stumbling over the debris scattered across the floor. Coleman turned back to the window. The riders were closer now, maybe 30 yards out. He could see Garrett among them, his face set, his gun raised. Coleman lined up a shot and fired. This time, he didn't miss. One of the men went down, clutching his leg, and the others scattered, diving for cover. Coleman ducked as return fire shredded the remaining glass, and then he was moving again, reloading, repositioning, trying to buy Ethan and Lizzie every second he could. The fire reached the edge of the yard, and the heat became unbearable. Sweat poured down Coleman's face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't stop. He fired again and again, each shot precise, deliberate. And then, in the chaos, he heard it, a scream. High-pitched, terrified, Lizzie. Coleman's blood turned to ice. He spun toward the bedroom and his heart dropped. The fifth rider, the one he'd lost track of, was standing in the doorway, his gun pressed to Ethan's head. Lizzie was on the floor sobbing, and Ethan's face was pale, his hands raised. "Drop it," the man said, his voice cold. Coleman's rifle didn't waver. Let them go. Drop it, or I paint the wall with his brains. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. Outside, the fire roared. Inside, the only sound was Lizzie's quiet, broken crying, and Coleman Briggs made his choice. He lowered the rifle. The man kicked the rifle away, sending it skittering across the floor. He kept the gun pressed to Ethan's head, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. His face was weathered hard, the kind of face that had seen too much and felt too little. Smart, the man said. For once. Coleman didn't move. His hands hung at his sides, loose but ready. You got what you want. Let the kids go. The man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You think this is about them? You think Garrett gives a damn about 2 runts? Then what's it about? Respect. The man's grip tightened on Ethan's shoulder, and the boy winced. You made us look like fools. That don't sit well. Coleman's eyes flicked to Lizzie, still on the floor, her small body shaking. Then back to the man. So this is pride. That what you're telling me? You're gonna kill kids over pride? The man's jaw worked. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough. For a moment, the man's expression wavered. Just a flicker, barely there, but Coleman saw it. Doubt. Or maybe regret. It was hard to tell. I got orders, the man said, but his voice was quieter now. Less certain. Orders. Coleman took a step forward, slow, careful. From Garrett. A man who burns fields and hunts children. That who you take orders from? Shut up. You got kids of your own? The man's face twisted. I said, shut up. Coleman took another step. I'm guessing you do. Or did. Maybe that's why you're standing here right now with a gun to a boy's head, trying real hard to convince yourself this is just business. It is business. No, Coleman said quietly. It's not. The man's hand trembled just slightly, but it was enough. You pull that trigger, Coleman continued, his voice steady, almost gentle, and you're not walking out of here the same man. You know that? I can see it in your eyes. You don't know I do. Coleman stopped close enough now that he could see the sweat beading on the man's forehead. Because I've been where you are. I've had the gun in my hand and the choice in front of me. And I made the wrong one. More than once. The man's breath hitched. You're lying. I'm not. Coleman's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. And you know I'm not? For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. The fire roared outside and the smoke rolled through the broken windows, thick and choking. Lizzie's sobs had faded to quiet hiccups, and Ethan stood frozen, his eyes wide, his breath shallow. Then slowly the man lowered the gun. Ethan stumbled forward and Coleman caught him, pulling him out of reach. The man stood there, his arm hanging limp at his side, his face blank. Get out, Coleman said. The man looked at him, and for a second something almost human flickered across his features. Then it was gone. He turned and walked out, disappearing into the smoke. Coleman knelt down beside Lizzie, checking her over. She wasn't hurt, just terrified. He pulled her close, and she buried her face against his chest, her small hands clutching his shirt. It's all right, he murmured. You're all right. Ethan sank to the floor beside them, his whole body shaking. I thought I know. The boy's face crumpled and he started to cry. Not the kind of crying that came from fear, but the kind that came from release, from everything finally breaking open. Coleman put his other arm around him, holding them both, and for a moment the world shrank to just the 3 of them. Outside, the fire still burned. But inside, in that small, broken space, something else kindled, something like hope. Why'd you do it? Ethan asked, his voice muffled against Coleman's shoulder. Why'd you risk everything for us? Coleman didn't answer right away. He thought about all the things he could say. about duty, about justice, about the way a man couldn't live with himself if he turned away from something like this. But in the end, he told the truth, because no one did it for me when I needed it, and I wasn't going to let that happen to you. Ethan pulled back, looking at him. His eyes were red, his face streaked with tears, but there was something else there now. Something like understanding. "Thank you," the boy whispered. Coleman nodded. "Come on. We need to get out of here before the whole place comes down." He helped them both to their feet and led them toward the trapdoor. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but it was their best chance. He went first, holding a lantern, and Ethan and Lizzie followed close behind, their hands gripping his coat. They emerged near the creek, the cool night air a shock after the suffocating heat of the house. Coleman looked back and saw the flames consuming the structure, the roof collapsing in on itself with a groan. Everything he'd built, gone. But the kids were alive, and that was enough. Dawn came slow and reluctant, bleeding pale light across the scorched land. Coleman stood at the edge of the creek, watching the remains of his house smolder. The fire had burned itself out sometime in the early hours, leaving behind only blackened timber and ash. The wind carried the smell of it, sharp and bitter, mixing with the scent of wet earth and pine. Ethan and Lizzie sat a few yards behind him, huddled together under a blanket Coleman had pulled from the tunnel storage. They hadn't spoken much since they'd emerged. There wasn't much to say, but they were alive. And in this world, that counted for more than most things. Coleman heard the hoofbeats before he saw the rider. A single horse, moving at a steady trot down the road. He tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver on his hip, the only weapon he'd managed to grab before the house went up. But when the rider came into view, Coleman relaxed. It was Sheriff Harlan, an older man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much but still managed to care. He pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "Hell," Harlan muttered. "Heard the fire from town. Came as fast as I could." "We're all right," Coleman said. Harlan looked past him to the kids. "They with you?" "They are now." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Garrett? Gone. For now. He'll be back. Men like him always are, maybe." Coleman's jaw tightened. "But not here. Not for them." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "You planning on sticking around?" Coleman glanced back at Ethan and Lizzie. The boy was watching him, his expression wary but hopeful. The girl had fallen asleep against her brother's shoulder, her face peaceful for the first time since Coleman had met her. "I don't know," Coleman admitted. "Haven't thought that far ahead." Harlan nodded slowly. "Well, when you do, come see me. Town could use a man like you, and those kids are going to need somewhere to go." "They got somewhere," Coleman said quietly. "They got me." The sheriff's expression softened. "All right, then." He climbed back onto his horse and tipped his hat. "You need anything, you know where to find me." He rode off, and Coleman turned back to the creek. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones, indifferent to everything that had happened on the land above it. Coleman knelt and splashed some on his face, washing away the soot and sweat. When he stood, Ethan was beside him. "What now?" the boy asked. Coleman looked at him. "Now, we rebuild. Here, somewhere? Doesn't have to be here." Coleman gestured toward the ruins. "A house is just wood and nails. It's the people inside that matter." Ethan's throat worked. "You're really going to keep us? Unless you got somewhere better to be." The boy shook his head, and a slow, hesitant smile broke across his face. It was the first time Coleman had seen him smile, and it changed everything. Made him look younger, less burdened. Like a kid who might actually have a future. "We don't got anywhere else," Ethan said. "Just you." Coleman clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Then I guess we're stuck with each other." Behind them, Lizzie stirred, blinking awake. She looked around, confused at first, and then her eyes found Coleman. She didn't say anything, but she reached out, her small hand extending toward him. Coleman took it, and in that moment, surrounded by ash and ruin and the ghosts of what could have been, something new took root. Something fragile and uncertain but real. A family. Yearslater. The ranch sat in a valley between two ridges, nestled among cottonwoods and wildflowers. It wasn't much a small house, a barn, a few head of cattle, but it was theirs. Coleman stood on the porch watching the sunset, just like he had that night so many years ago. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ethan was out by the barn, tall and broad-shouldered now, teaching Lizzie how to mend a saddle. She was 15, sharp-tongued and stubborn, with her mother's dark hair and her brother's fierce eyes. They argued constantly, the way siblings did. But Coleman could see the love underneath it, the way they looked out for each other, the way they'd never stopped looking out for each other. Ethan glanced up and caught Coleman watching. He raised a hand, and Coleman raised one back. "The boy no," the man smiled, and Coleman thought about that night. About the fire, the fear, the impossible choice. About the moment he'd lowered his rifle and decided that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. Especially then. Lizzie laughed at something Ethan said, the sound bright and clear, cutting through the evening air. Coleman closed his eyes and let it wash over him. He'd lost his house that night, but he'd found something better. He'd found home. The sun dips behind the ridge, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. On the porch of a small ranch house, a man stands alone but not lonely. In the barn beyond, two voices rise in laughter. The wind carries the sound across the valley, and for the first time in years, the land feels at peace.